Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we are back in the world of Vikram and Betaal. We have covered some Vikram and Betaal stories before, and you can find the links to those in the show notes. But if you haven't heard those, there's nothing to worry about. The stories themselves stand alone. The only context you need is the framing narrative, of which here's a quick summary. Vikramaditya, or Vik, was a wise king. He made all the right decisions for his people. His people showed their appreciation in many ways. One of them was a rishi, a stereotypically bearded wise man. The rishi gave Vik a fruit every day. Vik thought nothing of it until one day he discovered that each of those fruits contained a massive gem inside. The value of those gems, accrued over time, solidly put Vic in the mood to repay any favors that the Rishi might ask for. That's exactly what the Rishi wanted. He explained to Vic that what he needed to complete a special prayer was a Betaal. In case some of you don't know what that means, a Betaal is a reanimated corpse. It has been loosely translated as vampire by Europeans who had no idea of the full spectrum of creatures in Indian mythology. You could say that the term zombie is closer, except that Betals could also talk lucidly and could fly. All they did mostly was to hang down from trees like a bat. The Rishi said that the specific Betal he was interested in was hanging out in a peepal tree in a crematorium. And for reasons that the Rishi did not disclose, Vic had to go fetch the Betal from the tree in the middle of the night all by himself. Well, Vic didn't get to where he was by being a scaredy cat, so he accepted the Rishi's request without question. He had no trouble climbing the tree and grabbing the Betal. But when he was making his way back to the Rishi with the Betal on his back, the Betal told him a story. It was a story that had a question in the end. The kind of deep philosophical question that type A personalities like Vic could not resist answering. The only problem was that every time Vic opened his mouth to speak, it allowed the Betal to escape his grasp and fly away. The Betal went back to his spot on the tree, and Vic fetched him again. The Betal told him a new story, but again with the same outcome. Vic answered the question correctly, and the Betal escaped again. Rinse and repeat about 25 times. We have covered 7 of these stories before. Today, we'll hear an 8th one. The story begins, as all the other Vikram Betaal stories do, with Vic walking across the crematorium with the Betal on his back. The Betal remarked what a fine night this was. Vic said nothing. The Betal continued that this was the perfect night for storytelling, and he knew just the story to make the walk interesting. Just say no if you don't want to hear the story. the Betal said. Vic shook his head vigorously to indicate he was not in the mood for a story. But he couldn't actually say the word no. Speaking would allow the Betal to escape yet again. The Betal, getting the wrong end of the stick, said that since Vic seemed to be so enthusiastic, he would tell Vic the story of Indumati and corruption. Vic tried to block his ears. Naturally, that didn't work, because his hands were busy carrying the Betal on his back. And a crematorium in the middle of the night is no place to find earplugs or cotton buds. So he gave up. He didn't even sigh, because then the Betal would have escaped at the sound. He just rolled his eyes and listened to the storyteller. The Betal began narrating in a voice almost identical to mine. I bet you, my dear listeners, can't even tell the difference. Once in a kingdom called Gold Town or Kanchannagar, there lived a king, a queen, and their daughter. Also, thousands of subjects, but they largely do not feature in the story. The king's name was Chandradeep, and his daughter's was Indumati, which is a bit strange. Reason being that Chandradeep means moonlight, and Indumati is the full moon. You would have expected the parent to be the full moon and source of moonlight, instead of the other way around. But let's not dwell on the king and queen's inability to name their child well. What they lacked in creativity and analytical reasoning, they made up in social behavior. They brought up Indumati the way anyone would if they had an endless supply of taxpayer money. King Moonlight got his daughter everything, including the best education, the best weapons training, and a love for adventure and daredevilry. It was this last thing that probably influenced what happened later in the story. It started, as it often does, with King Moonlight bringing up the topic of marriage. Seriously, what is it with boomer parenting? Thought Indumati. All I hear is find a partner, settle down. Moonlight went on and on for hours at a time about finding a successor for the kingdom. His chief argument was that in the absence of a successor, how would the kingdom be governed? When Indumati suggested that perhaps it was time for elected representatives of the people to propose laws executed by an independent body of government, King Moonlight laughed off the suggestion. This kept happening for several days and weeks, until finally, Indumati was fed up. She decided she would find a way to put a stop to this. So she went to the library and checked out the princess edition of the book, How to Avoid Marrying the Wrong Guy in Medieval India. Her spinster aunt swore the book was effective. The princess spent a couple of days and nights poring over the book. Finally, when she was done reading the entire book cover to cover, she closed it, picked up her notes, and headed straight for the throne room. She didn't knock, she just walked in and announced to the full court that it was a half day. A gift from their future queen. Before her entry, the king had been talking, or rambling rather. He was mid-sentence in his criticism of the lack of a law protecting the disabled. None of the courtiers cared about it. And yet, because he was king, no one dared to interrupt him, except the princess. And she had done it without knowing the subject matter being discussed. Still, an early start to the weekend was more than welcome, so all the courtiers hurried out before the king could step in and override his daughter. When they had all cleared out, the king was a little sour, naturally. Must you do that every time? I was going to introduce a very important law regarding protection for the disabled. Don't worry, this was for a good cause, Indumati replied. Moonlight was still skeptical until Indumati said that she had decided she would marry. Have you picked someone? Asked the king with growing excitement. No, but I know how to. I'm going to do a Swayamvar. Well, of course, that's what Swayamvar means. You pick your partner. How can I help? Shall I line up all the princes from all our neighboring kingdoms? Moonlight asked. The princess explained that this wasn't just going to be a big party where Indumati would simply pick one of the princes to spend the rest of her life with. Besides, that big party idea, it could easily be disrupted, as Bhishma did in the Mahabharata. Instead, she was inspired by another example from history. You know how, in order to marry Draupadi, Arjun had to hit a fish in the eye without directly looking at it? She would set a task. Whoever completed it successfully would get to marry her. But they would have to complete the task exactly according to her chosen conditions. I don't know about those skill-based contests, said Moonlight skeptically. Those are very unpredictable, and you might end up saddled with the wrong sort. For example, let's say you asked to turn straw into gold. The only winner would be that horrid little goblin from that German folktale. You mean Rumpelstiltskin? Asked Indumati. Was that the name? I never can seem to remember his name. Anyway, the point is to be careful with these skills-based contests. But Indumati was confident that this would work. She just needed a whole lot of money, access to the royal ironsmith, weaponsmaker, and an architect. Well, King Moonlight had no objections. It wasn't his money anyway. The taxpayers could fund this mad project, whatever it was. When it was completed, it indeed looked like a mad scientist's project. King Moonlight saw the result at the same time as all the princes who had arrived for the Swayamvar. What they saw before them was a giant wall with a set of stairs leading to the top. To win, all you have to do is to walk up the stairs, began Indumati. All those steps? Have you seen how many there are? Grumbled one prince. Can I have my servant walk up for me? Asked another. I excuse your interruption, said Indumati. And yes, I know there are 40 steps. I designed this myself. But I'm not finished. After walking up the stairs, you have to stand on the wall and take a selfie? Interrupted another prince. No, you have to stand there and jump down on the other side, Indumati said. Is there a mattress on the other side? Asked another prince. Going by worried expressions, he was clearly speaking for them all. No, said Indumati. It's actually the opposite. Let me show you. And she did. The other side had a circular pen, but it wasn't just a regular pen with wooden stakes, the kind that is used to keep in farm animals. This one had spikes pointing both inward and outward. Whoever jumped in here was sure to be badly injured in a best case scenario. And for the final condition, said Indumati, you must survive the jump without so much as a scratch on your body. Nervous looks all around. One prince suddenly remembered a forgotten appointment and muttered an apology and departed. Other princes stuck around to try and weasel out of this somehow. They tried to see if there was a trick here. Maybe jumping off the wall need not mean jumping off on the side of the spikes. Maybe they could hop down the stairs one at a time and technically fulfill her condition of having jumped off the wall. Or maybe they could delegate the task. There wouldn't be a scratch on their body, and the winning prince would adequately compensate the poor servant who had been ordered to take one for the prince. But Indumati quickly addressed that she had specifically meant jumping down onto the side of the spikes. There was no rappelling down, no sliding down, no climbing down, no floating down, no protection equipment. Also, especially, no delegation to subordinates. To win the contest, one of them would have to jump down onto the spikes and survive without a scratch. More princes departed, without even providing an excuse this time. They all thought Indumati was insane. Or she just didn't want to marry. Or maybe she was in a conspiracy to eliminate as many neighboring princes as possible. In fact, the princess had intended not to marry anyone. She was delighted that things were going to plan. She did get nervous a little bit when there was one prince left, and he seemed to be enthusiastic about making the jump. What if he succeeded by some miracle? But there was nothing to worry about, as King Moonlight discovered that the boy was underage and would not be allowed to participate without his parent or guardian's consent on Forms 23, 42A, and 64J. That prince too left. No one wanted to take up this challenge. After 30 days of waiting, and over Indumati's protests, the king had to open up the contest to everyone, not just the royal born. This was required by law, and at that point, Moonlight would have gladly accepted a commoner for a son-in-law. But there were no takers. Most young men would have relished the chance of getting to marry the princess, becoming a ruler of the land and all that, but they could not see how they would be able to jump down the wall without injuring themselves on the spikes. So no one showed up, except for one guy. His name was Kurupshan. Kurupshan was born without arms. He was a young man who had been brought up by his father and stepmother, and not a day went by that his stepmother didn't curse him to his face. She cursed her fate for having to take care of him. Kurupshan did the best he could to manage and to cause less grief to others. But with his stepmother's personality, it was impossible. Every day was a living hell for him. He had finally decided to give in to one of his stepmother's frequent curses. He had decided that his life was not worth living. he would pass on. That way, at least his father and stepmother would not have to worry about him. But the difficulty was in choosing the method. His lack of arms made it an impossible task. And then he saw the posters advertising Indumati's Swayamvar. He carefully read the fine print to ensure that he wasn't excluded. But after double and triple checking, he saw that the only minimum qualification was age, and he definitely cleared it. That's how corruption came to the palace and stood before the wall. King Moonlight and Princess Indumati were taken aback by his appearance. Indumati did not have this image of a potential husband in mind. Besides being disabled, she thought he didn't look very handsome. But she couldn't very well prevent him from trying. No one else had even attempted the task yet. Maybe corruption would serve as a demonstration and discourage anyone else from trying. One very important thing before I begin, said corruption. The poster advertising the Swayamvar said participants could choose between a free electric toaster or a water purifier. I choose the water purifier. Please ship it to my father and stepmother. An official noted down his address and promised to take care of it. And then the contest began. Corruption walked up the stairs. That was the easy part. Standing on the thin wall without arms to balance was trickier. But corruption didn't have to stand for long. He jumped. By what seemed to be a miracle, corruption survived, without so much as a scratch on his body. Corruption's lack of arms had helped rather than hindered him. He had presented a smaller cross-section to the spikes, and luckily fallen exactly in the middle of two very large ones, narrowly avoiding both. Corruption was ecstatic. According to Indumati, his big smile only enhanced his ugliness. She turned to Moonlight and hastily whispered for him to find a technicality to disqualify corruption. But the king shook his head. Future King Corruption here had won fair and square. There was no going back now. Indumati had dug herself into this hole. She put on her sunglasses in order to hide the fact that she couldn't even stand to look at corruption. When the king congratulated corruption and began listing all the rewards that he had won, corruption audaciously interrupted him. Your Majesty, I thank you for the opportunity, but I cannot accept any reward. Indumati breathed a huge sigh of relief. She had dodged a bullet here. She felt that she now knew what corruption must have felt upon realizing that he had missed every spike. At least, that's how she thought of it. But is that really true? Wondered the Betaal. You know, Vic, I think corruption was rather foolish there, don't you think? Why would he reject the reward? He could have married Indumati. He would have been the future king. Makes no sense, does it? On the contrary, Vic replied. Corruption did a very wise thing. The experience was rewarding for him because it proved to himself and his stepmother that his disability was a strength, not a weakness. He had succeeded in a task that everyone else had failed or been too scared to even attempt. If that didn't give him positive recognition, He didn't know what would. That was the limit of what he considered a reward. Marrying the princess and eventually ruling the kingdom would actually be a punishment for him. He wasn't kidding himself. He couldn't govern the kingdom, not when he had no arms. How could he lead his soldiers into battle, for example? And besides, he didn't want Indumati for a wife anyway. She was too much of a spoiled brat, according to corruption. And Betal, if you're looking for who's been the most foolish of the lot, it's the princess. Indumati should not have set a contest like that if she was not prepared to accept this outcome. King Moonlight played by the rules, and he even warned her. By the way, Betal, is it me or did you just lose a lot of weight suddenly? But the Betal had not suddenly lost weight. Vic had been speaking all this while, which meant the Betal could escape. Vic saw the flying Betal, and from the thumbs up sign that the Betal was giving him, Vic knew that his answer had been the correct one. That's where we'll end it this week. A couple of notes on the show. You can check out the links to previous Vikram and Betaal episodes in the show notes and on the site sfipodcast.com. There's also the Singhasan Battisi series, which we have covered a couple of times. It's related to this one in the sense that there is a framing narrative and a sequence of stories told to a king. King Bhoj wanted to sit on a throne, and each of the 32 statues on the throne told him a story. The other connection there is that the throne had belonged to Vic. It was a gift from Indra, the chief of the Devs, who wanted to reward Vic. What Bhoj needed to decide before he ran out of stories and those storytelling statues was whether Vic owed his wisdom to the throne, or did he have to be wise already to qualify to sit on the throne. You can check the links to the Singhasan Battisi stories as well in the show notes. Vic has also featured in other stories, but we have not yet covered those on this podcast. Notably, one featuring a very long courtship with the Princess of China. But we'll get to that in the future. In the next episode, we'll do the story of Tripura. This isn't referencing the state in northeast India. Rather, it's about 3 cities that could fly. A concept dreamed up a long, long time ago, before the flying cloud city in Star Wars. Also featuring a fountain that can restore life to the dead, and a bull so thirsty it can drain any water body. And it features all of the Holy Trinity: Vishnu, the Preserver, Shiva, the Destroyer, and my dad, Brahma, the Creator. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you would like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.